Ms. Paulison.
Mr. Speaker, sir, DPM and Finance Minister Mr. Lawrence Wong announced at the recent Singapore International Energy Week, ahead of the ongoing COP27 UN climate talks in Egypt, that Singapore will step up our nationally determined contribution targets. Instead of peaking at 65 million tonnes CO2 in 2030, Singapore will step up our efforts to peak earlier and reduce carbon emissions to 60 million tonnes CO2 in 2030. And instead of just halving our long-term carbon emissions to 33 million tonnes CO2, we will aim for a stretch target of net zero carbon in 2050. Now, this is a bold announcement given Singapore's alternative energy disadvantaged position and our absolute dependence on the imported LNG for 95% of our country's electricity generation. However, as a responsible member of the international community committed to fight the climate emergency, Singapore's strategic commitment to achieve net zero by 2050 is a necessary undertaking. What does Singapore have to do differently in order to meet the net zero goal? In the long term, we will have to scale up the use of emerging technologies in low-carbon hydrogen, carbon capture utilization and storage, and maybe light nuclear energy production. In the medium term, we will have to purchase clean electricity imports and step up utilization of solar energy to progressively decarbonize the power sector. In the short term, we will have to aggressively abate carbon emissions in our economy. Therefore, the carbon tax is an important price signal and also an instrument to nudge industries to internalize the cost of carbon emissions into their business costs and to adopt low-carbon business practices. The government is cognizant of the cost burden of the carbon tax on businesses and consequential impact on the cost of living that will be passed on to the consumers. Hence, only facilities that produces more than 25,000 kilotonnes CO2 emissions annually will be subjected to the carbon tax. Also, the carbon tax will be implemented in a progressive manner. It will be increased from $5 per tonne CO2 emissions to $25 next year and to $45 in 2026. Even the long-term carbon tax of $50 to $80 expected in 2030 will still be considered comparable to the tax rates in other jurisdictions. For example, in Europe, where carbon taxes can go beyond $100 per tonne CO2 emission. In general, the business community here is appreciative that the introduction of carbon tax has been gradual so that there is sufficient response time to prepare for this transition. And I'm heartened to learn from the Minister that the revenue collected from carbon taxes are not meant for the purposes of deriving additional government revenue. Instead, the collection will be ploughed back to support decarbonization efforts and transition to a green economy. However, perhaps more could be done to enable this green transition, to help industries and to achieve better decarbonization results. I would like to ask the Minister, what is the projected revenue from carbon taxes that will be collected annually over the next 10 years? And what are the additional decarbonization programs, incentives, and subsidies that will be implemented to help industries, especially SMEs and LLEs, transit into the green economy? And what is the budget that's set aside for these programs and incentives? In Singapore, 40% of our national carbon emissions come from the power sector, while another 45% is attributed to the industries. Together with the transport sector, which contributes 14% of carbon emissions, these are the three key sectors that account for almost all of Singapore's carbon emissions. Clearly, the increase in carbon taxes in 2023 will add greater cost pressures to industries that are already facing the triple whammy of the COVID-19 pandemic, higher energy costs, and GST increase next year. Hence, I agree that the transition framework is a prudent strategy to help the emission-intensive trade-exposed sectors ride out this cost increase wave so that they can remain competitive against rivals in other jurisdictions that have nil or lower carbon taxes. Indeed, it will require a fine balance and sound judgment to use a carbon tax as a stake for some industries, while for other companies, the carbon tax can be waived to help them with transition. As outlined in Section 20D and 20E of the amended bill, discretionary powers are vested with the Minister for Trade and Industry and appointed public bodies to assess each company's decarbonization plans and determine if they are eligible for carbon tax exemption. On this note, may I ask the Minister if an impact analysis of carbon taxes on the overall business costs of affected companies has been carried out, in particular our SMEs and LLEs? Also, how much transition time will companies in the EITE sectors be given before they are subjected to the full-blown effect of the carbon tax increase? And for companies outside the EITE sectors, given that Singapore's transition to cleaner green energy may only materialize well beyond 2030, how will companies whose carbon emissions result mainly from the brown electricity needed for their operations be assisted in the next decade? These companies may be paying both higher electricity tariffs due to the current energy crisis, as well as increased carbon taxes for the carbon emissions generated. Otherwise, they may have to purchase renewable energies through private purchase agreements in order to meet carbon targets. Does MTI know the number of companies that will be in such a predicament, and how can they be assisted in the energy transition? Also, as carbon emissions accounting and ESG standards are still not fully harmonized, are there adequate, well-qualified consultants in the market to help companies, especially the SMEs and LLEs, to account for their carbon emissions footprint, to advise them on the sustainability strategies, and to project the corresponding carbon taxes? Will these consultants need to be accredited by the ministry? If so, will there be guidelines on consultancy fees chargeable to prevent companies from being subjected to paying yet another hefty layer of costs? I hope the Minister can shed some light on these implementation considerations so that businesses and their sustainability officers can have a clearer idea as they plan for next year's financial budget and dedicate resources for their decarbonization plans. Mr. Speaker, just like how charitable tax deductions can help reduce one's tax bills, carbon credits can also help a company reduce carbon taxes. Carbon credits provide a decarbonization pathway for hard-to-abate sectors and represent an opportunity to support emissions reductions globally. However, under the International Carbon Credits Framework, only up to 5% of the carbon emissions is eligible for ICC surrender. Moreover, only high-quality ICCs that are compliant with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement under the UNFCCC and fulfill the ICAO CORSIA standards as the minimum standards will be considered eligible for surrender. I understand that the rationale is to set a high bar so as to prevent greenwashing and also to ensure industries prioritize carbon emissions reduction as the main pathway for decarbonization. However, there will be three issues to consider. Firstly, for such high-quality ICCs to become meaningful carbon offsets options for companies, the price points must be comparable with the carbon taxes of $20 per ton CO2 starting in 2023 and eventually trending towards being $50 to $80 by 2030. According to Bloomberg market analysis, under tighter regulations, carbon credit prices may rise 30 times by 2029 to $224 per ton CO2 before tapering to $120 in 2050. Should Should such high prices prevail, then ICCs would become irrelevant for businesses as an alternative to paying carbon tax. Secondly, if only 5% of taxable emissions are eligible for ICC surrender, will there be adequate critical mass to support a vibrant carbon trading market in Singapore and meet our aspirations to develop Singapore as a carbon services and trading hub? Singapore is well placed to be a leading carbon services and trading hub. Singapore's robust legislative framework and position as an established professional services, trading and financial hub will put us in good position to support the development of an internationally trusted carbon services and trading ecosystem in Asia. To jumpstart this carbon trading hub, there should also be substantial domestic demand for carbon credits. Hence, I hope the Minister would consider increasing the limit beyond 5% of taxable emissions in the longer term. Thirdly, there are currently only 2 international exchanges in Singapore trading voluntary carbon credits, namely Air Carbon Exchange, established in 2019, and Climate Impact X, established in May 2021. The primary concern is that carbon credits are still not sufficiently reliable in quality because of multiple certification standards and processes. How will the ICC framework help these carbon credit exchanges ensure the quality and consistency of carbon credits traded comply with global standards? How will the ICC help to further develop the domestic carbon credits market? To this end, I hope the Minister will clarify the impact of the ICC framework on the future of carbon credit exchanges and our plans to develop Singapore as a leading carbon services and trading hub. Mr. Speaker, given the urgency of the global climate crisis, the carbon tax is a necessary evil in the short and medium term to steer industries towards carbon emissions abatement. However, the long-term energy strategy to reach net zero goals will be much more challenging. Alongside the revised NDC to achieve net zero by 2050, DPM Wong also announced the National Hydrogen Strategy. A lot of effort and resources will be needed for research and technology, as well as for new storage and distribution infrastructure, amongst others. Unfortunately, Singapore just does not have sufficient renewable energy. To overcome the twin wicked problems of climate crisis and energy crisis, we will have to leverage technological breakthroughs and succeed in delivering hydrogen solutions in order to address our long-term energy needs. Hence, I hope that part of the revenue collected from carbon tax will be channeled to fund the National Hydrogen Strategy. That way, the carbon taxes collected will play a meaningful role to help Singapore achieve a much more sustainable and a secured energy solution portfolio that's needed to achieve net zero emissions. Mr. Speaker, sir, notwithstanding my queries, I support the bill.